I work at a funeral home. Glamorous, I know. It's not the creepiest job in the world. At least not most of the time. You get desensitized to the whole death thing pretty quickly. But about 2 weeks ago, something happened that's made me question if I'll ever get used to it again. It started with the hearse. We've got this old jet black hearse that's been part of the funeral home's fleet for decades. It's a classic. You know the type. Big chrome grille, curtains in the back windows, and an engine that purrs like a content cat. Or it did, at least, before the incident. I'd been working late that night, catching up on paperwork and preparing for the next day's services. The funeral home was dead silent, pun intended, except for the occasional creak of the old wooden floorboards. I always tried not to think too much about what lay in the embalming room down the hall. You'd be surprised how quickly your imagination can run wild in a place like that. As I was about to lock up, I heard it. A low rumble coming from the garage where we keep the hearses. At first, I thought it was just the old pipes acting up again. They'd been making all sorts of weird noises ever since the winter freeze. But when I stepped into the garage, the sound got louder, more distinct. It wasn't the pipes. It was the hearse. The engine was idling, even though no one was there to start it. The keys were still hanging on the pegboard by the door. My stomach did this weird flip-flop thing, but I forced myself to walk closer. Maybe there's a short in the ignition, I told myself. As I reached the driver's side, the engine cut off abruptly. The silence that followed was oppressive, like the air had been sucked out of the room. That's when I noticed the smell. It was faint but unmistakable. The scent of burning wood and something else. Something metallic, like blood. I stepped back, and that's when I saw it. A black feather lying on the driver's seat. It looked too big to be from a crow or a raven, and it shimmered in the dim light, almost like it was coated in oil. I didn't touch it. I don't know why, but every instinct in my body screamed at me not to. I locked the garage and practically ran out of there, convincing myself it was just a weird coincidence. Maybe a bird had gotten in somehow, and the engine thing was just a mechanical glitch. But deep down, I knew that wasn't the case. I was driving the hearse to pick up a body from the hospital morgue. Standard stuff. The night was quiet, the streets empty, and a dense fog had rolled in, muting the sound of the car's engine as I pulled out of the funeral home parking lot. But as soon as I turned onto the main road, something shifted. The air inside the hearse grew dense, pressing against my skin like it was alive. Breathing became a conscious effort. Each inhale weighted with an unexplainable pressure. The engine began making a low growling noise, deep and rhythmic, like a large animal was resting beneath the hood. I convinced myself it was just the car's age. After all, the thing was practically a relic. Probably the exhaust, I muttered aloud, trying to steady my nerves as I rolled the windows down for some fresh air. That's when the radio, which I hadn't even turned on, crackled to life. Static hissed through the speakers, sharp and sudden, making me jump. My fingers scrambled to lower the volume, but before I could, something broke through the static. A voice. Soft and barely audible, like a whisper carried on a cold wind. "You'll see me soon." A chill raced down my spine, and my hands trembled as I shut the radio off so violently that the knob squeaked in protest. My heart pounded in my chest as I glanced into the rearview mirror, half expecting to see Something. The back of the hearse stared back at me, dark and empty. Or at least it looked empty at first glance. But as the streetlights flickered through the fog, I caught a glimpse of movement. Something subtle, a faint shift of shadow against shadow. It could have been my imagination, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. My eyes darted back to the road, but my mind was racing. Every small bump in the road, every whisper of wind against the car's frame felt charged, like a warning I didn't fully understand. By the time I reached the hospital, my hands were gripping the steering wheel so tightly that my knuckles ached. The growling noise from the engine had stopped, but the silence that replaced it felt even heavier. The hearse, and whatever was inside it, seemed to be waiting. The body I picked up was a man in his late 40s. Heart attack. Nothing unusual, or so I thought. Loading the body into the back of the hearse was routine by now. I'd done it hundreds of times. The stretcher clicked into place with its usual finality, and I closed the back doors with a slight shiver, though I couldn't explain why. Maybe it was the cold air, or maybe it was the way the hospital parking lot felt eerily silent that night. The drive back started uneventfully, the hum of the engine and the occasional bump in the road the only sounds breaking the stillness. But about 10 minutes in, I felt it. A vibration in the floor beneath my feet, followed by a soft thud from the back. At first I thought it was the stretcher shifting. The road was rough, and even though I always double-checked the locks, sometimes they needed an extra click. I pulled over onto the shoulder, the headlights casting long, ghostly shadows into the fog. Grabbing a flashlight from the glove compartment, I stepped out into the frigid night air. The sound of my boots crunching on the gravel was unnaturally loud, and for a moment, I was acutely aware of just how isolated I was. There were no other cars, no distant hum of traffic, just the soft rustling of the wind through the trees. When I opened the back doors of the hearse, I half expected the body to have shifted, or worse, fallen. But no, the stretcher was exactly where I'd secured it. The man's pale face was still covered, his hands folded neatly over his chest beneath the white sheet. Everything was perfectly in place. But there, lying on the floor near the stretcher, was something that shouldn't have been there. A single black feather. It was massive, far larger than any feather I'd seen before, and it shimmered faintly under the beam of my flashlight, as though coated in an oily substance. I crouched down, staring at it, and felt a chill run up my spine. We don't have birds in the hearse. Hell, there hadn't been a bird anywhere near me all night. I hesitated before reaching for it, something primal in me screaming not to touch it. My hand hovered inches above the feather, and I swear, in that moment, the air around me grew heavier. The silence deepened, and for a fleeting second, I thought I heard breathing. Soft, shallow, and coming from somewhere impossibly close. I yanked my hand back and stood up so quickly I almost stumbled. Slamming the doors shut, I climbed back into the driver's seat and locked the doors, my heart pounding in my chest. As I sat there, gripping the steering wheel, I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd disturbed. Something had For the rest of the drive, I couldn't stop glancing at the rearview mirror, half expecting to see something sitting in the back. But it stayed empty. At least I think it did. By the time I pulled into the funeral home's parking lot, my nerves were shot. I parked the hearse and sat there for a moment, trying to steady my breathing. When I finally opened the back doors to unload the body, the feather was gone. Over the next few days, things got worse. far worse than I ever thought possible. Every time I drove the hearse, it felt like a pair of unseen eyes were drilling into the back of my head, a prickling sensation that crawled along my skin and refused to fade. At first, I tried to rationalize it. It's just nerves, I told myself. You're jumping at shadows. But no amount of self-reassurance could quiet the dread building in my chest. Each new trip brought a deeper sense of unease, as if the vehicle itself had begun feeding on my fear. It began with subtle shifts in the atmosphere. The air inside the hearse grew colder, unnaturally so, like stepping into a freezer in the dead of summer. The chill wasn't just physical, it was invasive, wrapping itself around my chest and making each breath a conscious effort. Sometimes the radio, even when turned off, would emit faint bursts of static, a ghostly hiss that seemed to ebb and flow like waves. Occasionally, in the midst of the static, I'd catch snippets of something. A whisper, a sigh, maybe even a faint laugh. I'd snap the radio dial, turning it on and off, but the sound always returned, mocking me. And then there were the smells, acrid traces of smoke, the sharp tang of burnt wood and metal, drifting in and out with no discernible source. The culmination of these experiences came one night after what was supposed to be a routine body pickup. The hospital was quiet, its corridors dimly lit and filled with the faint hum of fluorescent lights. Everything had gone smoothly. The body was loaded onto the stretcher, secured in the back of the hearse, and I was on my way. The first half of the drive back was uneventful, the gentle hum of the engine my only company. But as the minutes ticked by, a shift occurred. It wasn't immediate, more like the slow build of a storm. The air inside the hearse grew heavier, pressing against my chest, and my breath became shallow. Then I saw it. As I glanced into the rearview mirror, my stomach twisted. There in the back seat was a shadow. Not a trick of light or an odd reflection, but a tangible presence. It sat there, unmoving, its form dark and dense, as though it absorbed the faint glow of the streetlights. Its edges seemed to ripple, like smoke caught in a breeze. And though it had no discernible face, I felt its gaze locked onto me. The weight of it was suffocating. Panic overtook me and I slammed on the brakes. The hearse skidded to a halt on the deserted road, the tires screeching against the pavement. My hands were shaking as I reached for the door handle. I had to see, I had to know what was back there. My breath hitched as I turned, half expecting, no, fully expecting something to be there. But the back seat was empty. The stretcher, the body, everything was as it should be. And yet the feeling of being watched didn't leave. It lingered, oppressive and inescapable, as though the shadow was still there, hidden just beyond the edges of perception. I sat there for what felt like an eternity, gripping the wheel until my knuckles turned white, my breath shallow and uneven. The air inside the hearse remained heavy, and I couldn't shake the sense that whatever it wasn't gone. No, it was simply waiting, biding its time. It wanted me to know it was there, and it wanted me to understand. It wasn't leaving. I told my boss about the weird stuff, hoping he'd say something like, "Oh yeah, that happens all the time." Instead, he just stared at me for a long moment, his face pale, his hands gripping the edge of his desk like he was trying to anchor himself to reality. His eyes, usually calm and distant, were wide with something that looked a lot like fear. Finally, in a voice barely above a whisper, he said, "Don't let it in." The weight in those 4 words was palpable, heavy enough to make my chest tighten. It wasn't just the words themselves, it was the way he said them, like a warning from someone who knew exactly what they were talking about. I pressed for an explanation, demanding he tell me what he meant. Let what in? The car? My voice was louder than I'd intended, the panic bubbling up. But he didn't flinch. He just shook his head, his gaze distant, like he was reliving some memory he'd buried deep. "It's best you don't know," he muttered, his tone final, like he'd already decided there was no point in explaining. Then he stood abruptly, almost knocking over his chair, and walked out of the room. I sat there for a moment, stunned, the echoes of his words ricocheting in my mind. Not exactly reassuring. His reaction wasn't something you could just shrug off, not when his usual demeanor was one of unshakable calm. The fear in his voice, in his body language, it stuck with me. It gnawed at my mind, turning over and over as I replayed the conversation. And the more I thought about it, the more uneasy I became. It wasn't just the hearse that was unsettling me anymore. It was the realization that my boss knew something about that car, and he was too afraid to tell me. The rest of the day I found myself hyper-aware of every sound, every shadow in the funeral home. By the time my shift ended, I wasn't sure if I was more afraid of the hearse or of what my boss had refused to say. I couldn't shake the feeling that the hearse had a history, one that no one wanted to talk about. And whatever that history was, it wasn't done with me yet. The next night I had a late pickup. The hospital was about 40 minutes away, and the drive there was uneventful. The city lights faded into the distance as the road stretched into the countryside, dark and cloaked in an eerie fog that seemed thicker than usual. The hearse moved smoothly at first, its engine humming a low, steady rhythm. But as I neared the hospital, a faint vibration started under my feet, growing stronger with each mile. On the way back, the hearse's engine started making that growling noise again. This time it was louder, more guttural, like an animal in pain. It didn't stop. The sound reverberated through the cabin, making my hands tremble as they gripped the wheel. The headlights carved through the fog, but the beams seemed to dissolve, swallowed up by the unnatural density of the mist. About halfway home, I noticed something was wrong. The road wasn't changing. No turns, no intersections. Just a straight, endless stretch of asphalt that seemed to loop back on itself. The trees lining the road, dark and skeletal, looked identical, repeating endlessly in my peripheral vision. I glanced at my GPS, hoping for reassurance, but it was frozen. The map showed my car's icon blinking in place, as though I hadn't moved at all. According to the clock, I'd been driving for over an hour, yet I wasn't any closer to the funeral home. The air inside the hearse grew stifling. I rolled down the windows, hoping for some relief. But the fog outside rushed in, carrying with it the acrid stench of smoke and something metallic, like burnt wires. My pulse quickened. Something was very wrong. And then the radio crackled to life again. Static hissed through the speakers, sharp and jarring. I hadn't touched the dial. My heart pounded as the static gave way to a faint, distorted voice. It wasn't music, and it wasn't a broadcast. The words came through garbled at first, but then they grew clearer. "You can't run." The voice was low, almost a growl, and it sounded as though it was coming from right behind me. My breath caught in my throat as I froze, too scared to check the rearview mirror. The growling engine, the suffocating fog, the endless road, all of it combined into a single oppressive force that pressed down on me. It felt as though the hearse itself was alive, trapping me in its unrelenting grip. Finally, I dared to look into the rearview mirror. The sight that met me nearly made me slam on the brakes. The back of the hearse wasn't empty anymore. Shadows coalesced there, darker than the night itself, writhing and shifting as though they had substance. And in the center of it, two faint pinpricks of light gleamed, unblinking and cold. I tore my eyes away, my heart hammering against my ribs. "This isn't real," I whispered to myself, gripping the steering wheel tighter. But the radio crackled again, the voice more insistent this time. "You can't run." The words seemed to echo, bouncing off the walls of the cabin. I pressed my foot harder on the accelerator, but the road stretched endlessly ahead, offering no escape. The fog seemed to close in, the darkness growing thicker, until it felt as though I was driving through a tunnel with no end. The growling noise from the engine grew louder, now joined by an unsettling creak, like metal bending under immense pressure. Panic surged through me. I slammed my fist against the radio, shouting, "Leave me alone!" The static hissed louder, drowning out my voice, until all I could hear was a cacophony of noise. And then, as suddenly as it had started, everything stopped. The growling engine, the static, the voice. All of it vanished, leaving behind a deafening silence. But the road was still there, stretching into infinity. And the shadows in the rearview mirror, they hadn't moved. Panic set in, sharp and consuming, as if every instinct in my body screamed at me to get away. My heart was hammering in my chest as I jerked the car to the side of the road, barely remembering to shift it into park before jumping out. The cold night air hit me like a slap, but it did nothing to clear the suffocating fear clouding my thoughts. With trembling hands, I yanked open the back doors of the hearse, desperate to confirm or deny what my gut was telling me. The body wasn't alone. Sitting next to the stretcher was a figure. At first, it was hard to process what I was seeing. The figure seemed to be made of pure darkness, a silhouette that absorbed every hint of light around it. Its edges rippled like smoke, but there was a weight to it, a solid presence that made the air feel heavier. And then there were its eyes, if you could even call them that. Two pinpricks of light, impossibly small yet searingly bright, burned in the center of its shadowy form, staring straight at me. It didn't move. It didn't speak. It just watched. The silence stretched, oppressive and deafening. My breath came in short, shallow bursts, my lungs refusing to fully expand. I wanted to run, to scream, to do anything to break the spell it seemed to cast over me. But I was rooted to the spot, unable to look away from those burning eyes. Finally, my body reacted before my mind could catch up. I slammed the back doors shut so hard that the echo rang out into the night, startling even me. My feet moved on their own, carrying me away from the hearse as fast as they could. I didn't know where I was going. I just knew I had to get away. The road was empty, swallowed by the dense fog that seemed to cling to everything. I ran until my legs burned, until my lungs begged for air, until the sound of my own ragged breathing drowned out the thundering of my pulse. The world felt disjointed, surreal, as if I'd stepped into a nightmare I couldn't wake up from. At some point, I don't know how long I wandered, I stumbled onto a familiar road. The sight of the streetlights and the faint outline of nearby buildings brought a wave of relief so strong that I nearly collapsed. I glanced over my shoulder, half expecting to see the hearse looming in the distance, its headlights glowing like predatory eyes. But there was nothing. The hearse? It was gone. I leaned against a lamppost trying to steady my breathing, but the image of that figure was burned into my mind. Its eyes, its stillness, the way it seemed to wait for something. When I got back to the funeral home, the hearse was parked in its usual spot, gleaming under the dim yellow glow of the parking lot lights. It looked as pristine as ever, as if it hadn't just been part of the nightmare I'd barely escaped. My hands tightened on the steering wheel as I sat there for a moment, staring at it from inside my own car, reluctant to get out. My head was pounding, my pulse thrumming in my ears. I couldn't shake the memory of those eyes, glowing pinpricks that had stared at me from the depths of the hearse's back seat. Was it even safe to approach it now? The fog from the drive had followed me back, curling around the lot like something alive. My breath fogged the windshield as I forced myself to move. Each step toward the hearse felt heavier than the last, like something invisible was pushing against me, trying to hold me back. Every nerve in my body screamed at me to turn around, but I couldn't. I had to check. I had to know. When I finally reached the back, I hesitated, my hand hovering over the door handle. My fingers brushed the cold metal, and I pulled back instinctively, like I'd been burned. Taking a deep breath, I gritted my teeth and yanked the door open. My heart was pounding so loudly, I barely registered the creak of the hinges. The back was empty. No body, no shadow, nothing. Just the stretcher, secured exactly where I'd left it. I stared for a moment, half expecting something to materialize out of the darkness. But as I leaned closer, I caught it, a faint, pungent scent. It was subtle but unmistakable, a mix of smoke and something sharp, metallic, like blood. The smell clung to the air inside the hearse, thick and accusing. I gagged, stepping back quickly and slamming the doors shut. I stumbled away, my legs weak beneath me. My hands were trembling so badly I had to press them against my thighs to steady them. I took a few deep breaths, trying to calm the frantic thudding in my chest. As I turned toward the building, I saw him, my boss. He was standing in the doorway, his silhouette framed against the dim, flickering lights of the hallway behind him. His arms were crossed, his posture tense, like he'd been waiting for me. When I walked up, he didn't ask why I came back without the body. He didn't say a word, not at first. He just stood there, studying me with those tired, knowing eyes, his expression unreadable. It was the kind of look that said he already knew everything. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, he spoke. His voice was low, quiet, and edged with something I couldn't quite place. Relief, maybe, or fear. You made it out. That's all that matters. His words hung in the air, heavy and cryptic. I opened my mouth to respond, to ask what he meant, but he turned and walked back inside before I could say anything. I stood there for a long moment, staring after him, the weight of his words settling on my shoulders. What had he meant? Why had he said it like that? The way he'd spoken. It wasn't reassuring. It was a warning. The night was still. Too still. The silence around me felt unnatural, almost oppressive, and the fog seemed to grow thicker, wrapping around me like a shroud. I glanced back at the hearse one last time. It sat there, silent and still. But I couldn't shake the feeling that it was watching me, waiting. I turned and walked into the building, my footsteps echoing hollowly in the empty hallway. My boss's words replayed in my mind over and over as I made my way to the staff room. I should have felt relieved to be back, but I didn't. Instead, I felt like I'd brought something with me, something I couldn't see, but that I could feel, hovering just out of reach. Since then, the hearse has started, following me. At first, I thought it was just paranoia, my mind playing tricks on me after the incidents I'd experienced. Maybe it wasn't the same hearse, just another black vehicle parked across the street or cruising through the neighborhood. But the truth became undeniable. It was always the same hearse, its jet black body gleaming even under dim streetlights, the chrome grille almost too pristine, as if mocking me. Its engine, low, deep, and rhythmic, rumbled like a predator's growl, sending vibrations through the air that seemed to resonate in my chest. I'd see it everywhere. Parked across the street from my apartment, idling at the corner of my block, or even just barely visible in the rearview mirror as I drove. Each time, it stayed long enough to make its presence known before disappearing into the night, leaving me shaken and questioning my own sanity. One night, the terror became impossible to ignore. I woke abruptly to the unmistakable sound of its engine outside my bedroom window. The low rumble was steady and deliberate, like it was daring me to come closer. My curtains were drawn, but even in the darkened room I felt its presence, heavy and suffocating, as though it had seeped through the walls. My breathing was shallow, my limbs frozen, caught between primal fear and irrational curiosity. I wanted to peek outside, to confirm it was there. But deep down, I already knew. The sound persisted for hours, unwavering and unrelenting, like a hunter waiting for its prey to make a move. Every creak of the floorboards, every whisper of wind against the glass felt magnified, feeding my terror. I stayed there, motionless in my bed, until the faint light of dawn finally pushed back the darkness. Only then did the rumbling fade, retreating like an ebbing tide. But its absence brought no comfort, just a lingering dread that crawled beneath my skin. Since that night, I've refused every job involving the hearse. My coworkers have started joking about it, calling it my irrational phobia. But their laughter only fuels my frustration. They don't understand. They haven't seen the shadows that linger near its wheels, or felt the unnatural cold that clings to the air around it. They haven't heard the voice that whispers from the static-filled radio, or felt the suffocating dread that comes with being watched. Let them think I'm crazy. I'll gladly wear that label if it means staying alive. Whatever that hearse is, it's not just a vehicle. And I'm not going anywhere near it again. Not if I want to survive. Last night, I woke up to the low, ominous growl of an engine idling outside my window. The sound was steady, relentless, and unmistakable. My heart raced as I sat up in bed, the darkness of my room pressing down on me like a weight. I didn't want to look, but something compelled me. I slid out of bed, my bare feet cold against the hardwood floor, and slowly moved toward the window. My hands trembled as I parted the curtains just enough to peek outside. There it was. The hearse sat in the street below, its sleek black body gleaming under the pale light of the street lamp. Its headlights were on, two glaring orbs that pierced through the darkness and seemed to fixate on me. They weren't just lights. They felt alive, like eyes, watching, waiting. My breath hitched as I noticed something else. A faint dark plume of smoke curling up from its exhaust, dissipating into the night like a warning. But it wasn't just the sight of it that froze me. On the windshield, scrawled in what looked like ash or soot, were two chilling words. It's time. My knees buckled and I stumbled back, pulling the curtains shut with shaking hands. I pressed my back against the wall, my chest heaving as panic set in. What did it mean? Why was it here? My mind raced, but no answers came. Only the deafening silence of my room and the ever-present growl of the engine outside. I stayed like that for hours, sitting on the floor with my arms wrapped around my knees, waiting for the sound to stop. But it didn't. Not until the first rays of dawn bled through the curtains did the engine finally cut off. I forced myself to look outside again, dreading what I might see. The hearse was gone. I don't know what it wants or why it's after me, but I know one thing. It's not over. If you ever see a black hearse with curtains in the windows and an engine that growls like something alive, don't stop. Don't get in. Don't even let your eyes linger on it for too long. Just run. Because once it finds you, it never lets go.